The machine surrounding my stepmother's hospital bed beeped in a rhythmic symphony of approaching death. I held her cold hand, expecting some final words of comfort or perhaps an apology for 19 years of distant motherhood. Instead, Caroline's eyes snapped open with startling clarity and she whispered 5 words that would destroy everything I thought I knew about myself. I switched the babies, Natalie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her grip tightened around my fingers with surprising strength for someone so close to death. Your real parents, she gasped, each word a struggle against failing lungs. They never knew what I took from them. 3 days later, I found myself standing outside a Seattle mansion worth more than I could earn in 10 lifetimes, holding documents that proved I was supposed to be the daughter inside those golden walls. The fluorescent lights of Cedar Valley Medical Center cast everything in a sickly yellow glow as I hurried down the corridor toward the intensive care unit. It was nearly 3 in the morning, and the hospital felt like a tomb filled only with the distant sounds of ventilators and the soft squeaking of nurses' shoes against linoleum. I'd driven 4 hours straight from Portland after receiving the call that Caroline was dying, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. 19 years of living with Caroline Brennan as my stepmother, and I still wasn't sure how I felt about her impending death. Our relationship had been cordial but cold, like roommates who shared the same house but never really connected. She'd married my father David when I was 8 years old, just 6 months after my mother died in a car accident that still haunted my dream. Caroline never tried to replace my mother, which I appreciated, but she never tried to become a real parent to me either. We coexisted in polite distance, she providing what was necessary while I learned to need as little as possible. The ICU was dimmer than the hallway, filled with the constant electronic chorus of life support machines keeping the dying alive just a little longer. Caroline lay in bed number 7, looking smaller than I remembered, her once dark hair now gray and thin against the white pillowcase. The lung cancer had ravaged her body over the past 6 months, but she'd refused most visitors, insisting she wanted to handle her death with the same privacy she'd handled her life. A nurse with kind eyes and tired features approached me near the doorway. "Are you Natalie?" she asked softly. When I nodded, she continued, "She's been asking for you all evening. The morphine makes her drift in and out, but she's been very insistent about speaking with you alone." I approached Caroline's bedside slowly, unsure what to expect. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing was labored and irregular. The oxygen mask covered most of her face, but I could see her lips moving slightly as if she was practicing words she needed to say. I settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her bed and waited, listening to the mechanical rhythm of the machines keeping her alive. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Caroline's eyes fluttered open. They were clearer than they'd been in weeks, as if some inner fire had been rekindled by whatever she needed to tell me. She reached up with a shaking hand to pull the oxygen mask away from her mouth, and I leaned forward to catch her whispered words. "Natalie," she said, her voice barely audible above the electronic beeping surrounding us. "I need to tell you something about who you really are." I assumed the medication was making her confused. Caroline had always been sharp mentally, even as her body failed, but dying people often became disoriented in their final hours. "I'm your stepdaughter," I said gently, trying to comfort her. "I'm David's daughter. You've taken care of me since I was 8. Caroline's eyes focused on me with sudden intensity, and she shook her head weakly. "No, you're not David's daughter. You're not his biological child." Her words came out in rushed whispers, as if she was afraid she might die before she could finish. "I worked at the hospital when you were born. Cedar Valley General. I was a nurse in the maternity ward." The room seemed to tilt around me. Caroline had worked at the hospital, that much was true. She'd met my father there when my mother was dying from her injuries after the accident. But what she was saying now made no sense. "There was another baby born that night," Caroline continued, her grip on my wrist tightening. "A little girl born to the Ashworth family, very wealthy people, important people." Even in my confused state, I recognized the name. The Ashworths owned half the commercial real estate in the Pacific Northwest. Their name was on buildings throughout Seattle. Caroline's breathing became more labored, but she pushed forward with her confession. "Their baby was sick, very sick. The doctors weren't sure she would survive. But you," she looked directly into my eyes. "You were perfect, healthy and beautiful, and everything a parent could want after losing a child." My heart was racing now, pounding so hard I was sure the cardiac monitors in nearby beds would pick it up. "Caroline, what are you saying?" "I switched you," she said, each word deliberate despite her failing strength. "I gave David the healthy baby, you, and left the Ashworth family with their sick child. I wanted David to have something perfect after losing your mother. I thought their baby might die anyway and then no one would have to know. The plastic chair creaked as I fell back into it, my mind reeling. That's impossible. There would be records, birth certificates, blood tests. Someone would have noticed. Caroline's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile if it weren't so tragic. I was the charge nurse that night. 3 babies born within 2 hours, including you and the Ashworth girl. It was chaos, understaffed, emergency situations, families stressed and not paying attention to details. Easy to switch identification bracelets before anyone looked too closely. She paused to catch her breath, the oxygen mask fogging with each exhalation. I destroyed the original records and created new ones. Changed the footprint cards, the blood typing documentation, everything. Made it look like a clerical error that was corrected. I stared at this woman who had raised me, trying to process what she was telling me. But the Ashworth baby, what happened to her? She survived, recovered completely, grew up as Victoria Ashworth, heir to everything that should have been yours. Caroline's voice grew weaker, but her eyes never left my face. She's 27 now, same as you, runs their family foundation, lives the life you were born to live. The implications crashed over me like a tide. While I had grown up in a modest house, worrying about money for school clothes and college tuition, another woman my age had grown up in mansions, attending private schools, traveling the world, never wanting for anything. She'd had tutors and music lessons and opportunities I'd never dreamed of, all because a nurse had decided to play God with 2 newborn babies. Why? I whispered, though part of me already knew the answer. Caroline's eyes filled with tears for the first time in the conversation. Because David was broken after losing your mother. He loved her so much, and watching her die destroyed something in him. When I saw you in the nursery, so healthy and perfect, I thought I could give him back some happiness. I thought I could fix what life had broken. By stealing someone else's child. By giving you both a chance at a better life than you would have had. Caroline's voice was getting weaker, but she wasn't finished. Your biological parents, they were young, unmarried, no family support. The father had already left before you were born. Your birth mother was planning to give you up for adoption. I thought David could provide stability, love, everything you needed. I tried to imagine this other version of my life, the one Caroline had stolen from me. Growing up as Victoria Ashworth, with unlimited resources and opportunity, private schools that would have challenged my mind instead of overcrowded public schools where I learned to make myself invisible, college without the constant stress of student loans, travel, culture, connections that could have opened doors I didn't even know existed. But then I thought about my father, the man who had loved me unconditionally even when I was moody and difficult as a teenager, who had worked double shifts to pay for my college, who had been so proud when I graduated and found my job as a dental hygienist. He had been a good father, even if he'd never known I wasn't biologically his child. Does my real birth mother know? I asked. Caroline shook her head. She thinks you were adopted by a loving family somewhere. She never knew which family or what happened to you after she signed the paper. I made sure of that. The weight of what Caroline had done settled over me like a heavy blanket. 2 families had been living lies for 27 years. Victoria Ashworth had grown up not knowing her real parents, while my biological mother had spent nearly 3 decades wondering about the child she'd given up. I kept copies, Caroline said suddenly, startling me out of my thoughts, of all the original documents, the real birth certificates, the blood work, the footprints, hidden them all these years in case. She trailed off, too exhausted to finish. Where? The question came out before I could stop myself. Caroline fumbled under her pillow and produced a small brass key. Safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box 24/7. She pressed the key into my palm with trembling fingers. Everything's there, the proof of what I did and why. I stared at the small key, warm from being clutched in Caroline's dying hand. It was such a tiny thing to hold such enormous consequences. What do you want me to do with this? That's up to you, Caroline said, her eyes starting to drift closed. I just couldn't die with this secret. You deserve to know the truth about who you really are. A nurse appeared beside the bed, checking Caroline's vital signs with practiced efficiency. Her blood pressure was dropping, and her breathing was becoming more irregular. The end was coming soon. Caroline's eyes opened one last time, focusing on my face with great effort. The other girl, she whispered, Victoria Ashworth, she has your life, Natalie, the life you should have had, but she's also had your struggles. Just different ones. Money doesn't solve everything. Before I could ask what she meant by that cryptic comment, Caroline's eyes closed for the final time. The machines around her bed began beeping more frantically as her vital signs failed. Nurses rushed in from all directions, but I could see in their faces that it was too late. Caroline Brennan died at 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, taking her 27-year-old secret with her to the grave. Except it wasn't a secret anymore. It was my reality now, sitting heavy in my chest like a stone. I looked down at the brass key in my palm, this tiny piece of metal that could unlock the truth about my entire identity. Part of me wanted to throw it away, pretend this conversation had never happened. Return to my quiet life in Portland, where I was simply Natalie Brennan, dental hygienist and unremarkable person. But another part of me, a part that had always felt slightly disconnected from my own life without understanding why, needed to know more. I needed to understand what Caroline had stolen from me, and what she had given me in return. The funeral arrangements took 3 days to finalize, and I spent that time in a fog of confusion and grief that had nothing to do with Caroline's death and everything to do with her revelation. I found myself studying my reflection in mirrors, looking for signs of the Ashworth features I'd seen in newspaper photos over the years. Did I have Victoria's dark hair before I started coloring it auburn? Were my brown eyes the same shade as her father Rob? On Friday morning I drove to First National Bank with Caroline's key clutched in my sweaty palm. The safety deposit box was exactly where she'd said it would be, and the contents made her impossible story undeniably real.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
2 birth certificates with different names but the same date and time of birth. Hospital records showing Caroline Brennan as the attending nurse. Blood type documentation that had been altered. And most damning of all, a letter in Caroline's handwriting dated 27 years ago, detailing exactly what she had done and why. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, written like a confession she never intended to share. In it, Caroline described watching my biological mother, a frightened 18-year-old named Lisa Chen, struggle with the decision to give me up for adoption. She wrote about seeing the grief in my father's eyes, as he visited the hospital daily, hoping against hope that my mother might recover from her accident injury. And she described the moment she decided to solve both problems by switching 2 babies, giving David a healthy child to love and ensuring I would grow up in a stable home instead of the uncertain future of the adoption system. What she hadn't anticipated was that the Ashworth baby would recover completely, growing up to inherit a fortune while I scraped by on middle-class wages, or that both families would spend nearly 3 decades living with the consequences of her decision without knowing the truth. Sitting in the bank's sterile privacy booth with these documents spread before me, I realized my entire life had been built on a lie. Not just my life but Victoria Ashworth's life too. We were both victims of Caroline's misguided attempt to play God with 2 newborn babies. The question now was what to do about it. I could continue living as Natalie Brennan, pretend Caroline's confession was the delirious ramblings of a dying woman, and go back to my quiet life in Portland. Or I could use these documents to uncover the truth, find Victoria Ashworth, and force both of us to confront the reality of our switched identities. As I drove home that afternoon, I kept glancing at the manila envelope containing the documents on my passenger seat. By the time I reached my small apartment, I knew what I had to do. Caroline's secret had already changed my life simply by being revealed. There was no going back to ignorance now. I opened my laptop and began researching everything I could find about Victoria Ashworth, and the family that should have been mine. What I discovered would change everything I thought I knew about the life that had been stolen from me, and set in motion events that neither Caroline nor I could have anticipated. The woman living my life was dying, and she had no idea that her salvation might lie in the stranger who had been living hers. My laptop screen glowed in the darkness of my Portland apartment, as I scrolled through article after article about Victoria Ashworth. It was nearly midnight, but sleep seemed impossible after everything I'd learned. The documents from Caroline's safety deposit box lay spread across my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle I was afraid to complete. Victoria Ashworth was everywhere online. Charity galas, business conferences, interviews about the foundation's work with homeless youth. She was articulate and poised in every photo, the kind of woman who seemed to effortlessly command respect in boardrooms and social settings. Her dark hair was always perfectly styled, her clothing expensive but understated, her smile confident but somehow distant. This should have been my life. These opportunities, this education, this ability to make a real difference in the world, instead of cleaning teeth and struggling to pay student loans. The bitterness that thought brought surprised me with its intensity. I'd never considered myself an envious person, but seeing the life that had been stolen from me, laid out in glossy magazine photos, was harder than I'd expected. What struck me most, though, was how isolated Victoria seemed despite her wealth and status. In group photos, she stood slightly apart from others, In interviews, she spoke passionately about her work but revealed nothing personal about herself. There were no mentions of close friends, no romantic relationships, no hobbies or interests beyond the foundation. It was as if her entire identity was built around the charitable work, leaving no space for a personal life. I was deep into reading a profile about the Foundation's latest homeless shelter project when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. "Is this Natalie Brennan?" The voice was crisp, professional, unmistakably wealthy in the way that came from generations of good breeding and expensive education. My heart started racing. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Margaret Rothwell. I'm an attorney representing the Ashworth family. I believe we need to have a conversation about Caroline Brennan and what she told you before she died." The phone nearly slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers. "How could you possibly know about that?" "Miss Brennan, this is a delicate matter that requires discretion. Could you meet me tomorrow afternoon? There's a great deal you need to understand about your situation and Victoria's." The implication hit me like a physical blow. You've known all along." Margaret's voice softened slightly, though it remained businesslike. "Meet me at Riverside Cafe on 3rd Avenue at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Come alone, and please bring any documentation Caroline may have left you." She ended the call before I could ask any of the dozen questions racing through my mind. I sat in my darkened living room, staring at the phone and trying to process what had just happened. The Ashworth family knew about the switch. They'd known, and they'd done nothing about it. The next morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. I called in sick to work, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the meeting ahead of me. I drove to Seattle in a daze, the manila envelope containing Caroline's documents sitting beside me like a loaded weapon. Riverside Cafe was the kind of place where business deals were made over artisanal coffee and organic pastry. Margaret Rothwell was easy to spot. She had the same polished appearance as Victoria, though she was older, her silver hair styled in a severe bob that spoke of someone who valued efficiency over frivolity. She was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, a leather portfolio open in front of her. "Miss Brennan," she stood to shake my hand, her grip firm and assessing. "Thank you for coming. Please." I slid into the booth across from her, clutching the envelope containing Caroline's documents. "How long have you known?" Margaret poured herself tea from a pot that had clearly been waiting for my arrival. "About the switch, approximately 12 years. Victoria needed a kidney transplant when she was 15. During the pre-surgical workup, it became clear she wasn't biologically related to either Robert or Helen Ashworth." The cafe noise seemed to fade around us. 12 years? You've known for 12 years, and never said anything." The family hired private investigators immediately. Within 6 months, we had the complete truth about what Caroline had done. Margaret opened her portfolio and slid several documents across the table. Hospital records, investigative reports, DNA analysis, everything pointing to the same conclusion Caroline confessed to you. I stared at the papers, recognizing some of the same hospital forms I'd found in Caroline's safety deposit box. But these were far more comprehensive. Professional investigators had uncovered every detail of the switch, documented every piece of evidence, tracked down witnesses who had long since retired or moved away. "Why didn't you expose her? Why didn't you tell Victoria?" Margaret's expression grew carefully neutral. "Because by the time we discovered the truth, Victoria had been the Ashworth's daughter for 15 years. She was their child in every way that mattered except biology. The decision was made to protect her from information that would have been devastating and served no practical purpose." I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice. What about me? What about the fact that I was living in poverty while she had everything that should have been mine? "You weren't in poverty," Margaret said calmly, consulting another document. "David Brennan was a good man who provided well for you. You attended good schools, received a solid education, had a stable, loving home. Caroline's actions, while misguided, didn't result in neglect or abuse." The casual dismissal of my struggles stung. "I worked 3 jobs to pay for community college. I've been paying off student loans for 6 years. I live in a studio apartment and drive a 15-year-old car. And Victoria has spent the last 12 years managing a chronic illness that nearly killed her twice." Margaret replied without emotion. "Wealth doesn't eliminate all suffering, Miss Brennan." Before I could respond, she continued, "Which brings me to why I'm here today. Victoria's kidney disease has progressed. The transplant she received as a teenager is failing, and she needs another one. This time, the doctors believe her best chance of survival is a genetic match." The implication settled over me like ice water. We want to save her life, and we're prepared to compensate you substantially for your help." Margaret slid another document across the table. $50,000 for compatibility testing, $200,000 if you're a match, $500,000 if you agree to donate. I stared at the figures, more money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house, maybe even go back to school for something more meaningful than dental hygiene. But the calculating nature of the offer made my skin crawl. You've had investigators watching me for 12 years, haven't you? You know exactly how much money would tempt me. Margaret's silence was answer enough. Does Victoria know about any of this? About me? About the switch? No. The family felt that information would be too traumatic given her medical condition. She believes she's receiving an organ from an altruistic stranger who happened to be an excellent match. The thought of Victoria dying while I lived with the knowledge of who she really was felt unbearable, but the idea of being used as a spare parts donor for the family that had stolen my identity was equally revolting. I need time to think about this. Of course. Margaret handed me a business card. But Miss Brennan, time is something Victoria doesn't have much of. Her doctors estimate she has weeks, perhaps a month or two at most. That evening, I sat in my hotel room, overlooking Elliott Bay, wrestling with a decision that felt impossible. Through my research, I'd learned that Victoria had transformed the Ashworth Foundation from a tax write-off into a genuine force for social change. Under her leadership, they built 3 homeless shelters, funded job training programs, and provided college scholarships to hundreds of disadvantaged youth. She was using the advantages she'd inherited, advantages that should have been mine, to help people who reminded me of myself. But she was also dying, and I was apparently her best hope for survival. I spent the next 2 days in Seattle watching Victoria from a distance. I learned her routine: coffee at a small cafe near the foundation offices each morning, lunch meetings with donors and city officials, evening visits to the foundation's various projects. She moved carefully, I noticed, with the deliberate pace of someone conserving energy. Her skin had a grayish pallor that even carefully applied makeup couldn't completely hide. On Wednesday evening, I followed her to a fundraising event at the downtown Hilton. The gathering was smaller than the charity galas I'd seen in photos, maybe 60 people in an elegant hotel ballroom. I bought a ticket at the door, claiming to be a potential donor interested in learning about the foundation's work. Victoria spoke for 20 minutes about the foundation's newest project, a job training program for former homeless individuals. Her passion for the work was evident, but so was her exhaustion. She gripped the podium as she spoke, and I noticed her hands trembling slightly. When she finished, she immediately sat down, declining to mingle with the crowd as she usually did. I found myself approaching her table, drawn by curiosity and something deeper I couldn't name. She looked up as I approached, her smile polite but distant. "I don't think we've met," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Ashworth. Thank you for coming tonight." "Natalie," I replied, shaking her hand. The contact felt surreal, touching someone who was essentially my genetic twin, someone who should have been my sister. "Your presentation was inspiring. The job training program sounds like it could really make a difference." Victoria's smile became more genuine. "That's the hope. So many people assume homelessness is about laziness or addiction, but most of our clients are dealing with circumstances beyond their control: job loss, medical bankruptcy, domestic violence. They just need someone to believe in them and give them the tools to rebuild." We talked for nearly an hour about the foundation's work, about the challenges of addressing systemic poverty, about the frustration of trying to create lasting change in a world that preferred band-aid solutions. Victoria was thoughtful and articulate, but also surprisingly humble about the foundation's accomplishments. She spoke about the work as if she were simply a steward of resources rather than the driving force behind their success. "Do you have family in Seattle?" Victoria asked, as the event wound down. The question caught me off guard. "Not exactly. I'm from Portland originally, but I have some connections here." It wasn't entirely a lie, though the connection was sitting across from me without knowing it. "I envy you," Victoria said unexpectedly. "Having connections? I mean, this work is fulfilling, but it can be isolating. Most people in my social circle see charity as something you do for tax benefits and photo opportunities. It's rare to meet someone who understands that this is about actual people, not abstract causes." There was loneliness in her voice that money couldn't touch. Despite her wealth and status, Victoria seemed as disconnected from meaningful relationships as I felt in my own life, just for different reasons. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" The invitation surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise her. "I mean, if you'd like to talk more about the foundation's work, I might be interested in volunteering." Victoria's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen all evening. I would love that. Are you free tomorrow morning? There's a small cafe I like near the office. The next morning, I met Victoria at Grind Coffee, a modest place that seemed incongruous with her wealth and status. She was already there when I arrived, looking more relaxed than she had at the fundraiser. Without the formal setting and audience, she seemed younger, more approachable. I have to admit, Victoria said as we settled into a corner table with our coffee, I don't usually connect with people this quickly. There was something about our conversation last night that felt different. I studied her face, looking for similarities I might have missed before. Our bone structure was different, our coloring, our builds, but there was something in her expressions, in the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, that felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe it's because we both understand what it's like to feel displaced, I said carefully. Like we're living lives that don't quite fit. Victoria looked at me with sharp interest. That's exactly how I feel sometimes, like I'm playing a role that was written for someone else. She laughed, but there was no humor in it, which sounds ridiculous coming from someone with every advantage in the world. Advantages don't guarantee happiness, I replied, thinking of Caroline's final words. Sometimes they just make it harder to identify what's missing. We talked for 2 hours, our conversation ranging from philosophy to politics to personal dreams deferred. Victoria was incredibly intelligent, but also deeply empathetic in a way that wealth often discouraged. She listened more than she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives as someone from a different economic background. When she excused herself to use the restroom, I noticed her walking more slowly than before, one hand briefly touching her side as if in pain. The reminder of her illness brought me back to the real reason I was there, the impossible decision I was still trying to make. Are you feeling all right? I asked when she returned to the table. Victoria waved dismissively, but I could see the fatigue in her eyes. Just tired. I haven't been sleeping well lately. Too much caffeine. Probably. It was clearly a deflection, but I didn't push. As we prepared to leave, Victoria hesitated. This might sound forward, but would you be interested in seeing some of the Foundation's projects? I think you'd be impressed by what we've accomplished, and we could always use more volunteers who understand the real issue. I agreed, curious to see more of the work Victoria had built with the advantages that should have been mine. Over the next week, she showed me 3 homeless shelters, 2 job training centers, and a scholarship program that sent 20 kids to college each year. The scope of what the Foundation accomplished was staggering, but what impressed me most was Victoria's hands-on involvement. She knew the names of shelter residents, remembered details about scholarship recipients' progress, and treated everyone with genuine respect regardless of their circumstances. You're not just writing checks, I observed as we watched a job training session at one of the centers. Money is easy when you have it, Victoria replied. Time and attention are what actually create change. Anyone can fund a program, but making sure it works requires showing up. That evening, as we sat in Victoria's penthouse apartment, overlooking Puget Sound, she finally opened up about her health struggles. The kidney disease, the failed transplant, the uncertainty of waiting for another match. She spoke matter-of-factly about dying, as if it were simply another logistical challenge to manage. I've had a good life, she said, looking out at the water. Better than I deserved, probably. If this is how it ends, I can accept that. My only regret is leaving the Foundation's work unfinished. I wanted to tell her then, about Caroline's confession, about the switched identities, about the fact that I might be able to save her life, but the words wouldn't come. How do you tell someone that their entire identity is based on a lie, that the person sitting across from them should have lived their life instead? Instead, I found myself making a different kind of confession. What if I told you I was considering organ donation? Not for anyone specific, just in general. Victoria looked at me with surprise. That's incredibly generous, but also incredibly serious. It's major surgery with real risks. So is dying, I replied. She was quiet for a long moment, processing my words. Is this about our conversation, about feeling displaced, like you need to find meaning in your life? It was partially about that, but also about seeing Victoria's work up close, understanding that she was using her privileges to help people like me, people from backgrounds of struggle and limited opportunity. She'd taken the advantages stolen from me and turned them into something meaningful for others. Maybe, I said, Or maybe it's about recognizing when you can make a difference in someone's life and choosing to act instead of just thinking about it. Victoria reached across the table and took my hand. If you're serious about this, there are extensive compatibility tests, psychological evaluations, months of preparation. It's not a decision to make lightly. I understand that. I squeezed her hand, this woman who should have been my sister, who was dying while I struggled with the knowledge that could save her. But some decisions are worth the complexity. The next morning, I called Margaret Rothwell and told her I was ready to begin the testing process. But I had one condition. I wanted Victoria to know the truth about who I was before any medical procedures began. She deserved to understand why I was willing to make this sacrifice, and she deserved to know that her entire life had been built on someone else's decision to play God with 2 newborn babies. Margaret was not pleased with my condition, but she eventually agreed. We would tell Victoria together, and then she could decide whether to accept help from the stranger who should have been her sister all along. The medical testing began on a rainy Thursday morning at Seattle General Hospital. I sat in the sterile waiting room, filling out forms that asked about family medical history I didn't truly know, genetic conditions that might not be relevant to my actual DNA, and lifestyle factors that seemed inadequate to capture the complexity of what we were attempting. Sarah Kim was the transplant coordinator, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of calm competence that came from years of navigating life and death decisions. She explained the process in detail: blood work, tissue typing, psychological evaluation, comprehensive health screening. The whole battery of tests would take 3 days, and then we'd wait another week for results. "Have you met the recipient?" Dr. Kim asked, as a nurse drew what felt like the 10th vial of blood. "Yes," I replied, not elaborating on the complexity of that relationship. "Good. It helps with the emotional aspects of donation when there's a personal connection. Anonymous donation can be difficult for both parties." Dr. Kim made a note in my file. "The psychological evaluation will explore your motivations. Make sure you're making this decision for healthy reasons." I almost laughed at that. What would count as a healthy reason for giving a kidney to the woman who had been living the life stolen from you? Guilt? Justice? A twisted sense of family obligation to someone who wasn't actually family. I doubted any of my real motivations would pass the psychological screening. The evaluation itself was conducted by Dr. Amanda Torres, a sharp-eyed psychologist who seemed to see through every careful answer I gave. We sat in her office, overlooking the hospital's healing garden, while she probed my decision with the persistence of someone who'd heard every possible justification for organ donation. "Tell me about your relationship with the recipient," Dr. Torres said, pen poised over her notepad. "We've become friends recently. I admire the work she does with her foundation. All true, but not the whole truth. And what draws you to organ donation specifically?" "It's a significant sacrifice for someone you've known for such a short time." I'd rehearsed this answer, but sitting under Dr. Torres' scrutiny, the words felt hollow. Sometimes you meet someone and recognize that they're doing important work in the world, work that should continue. If I can help with that, it seems like the right thing to do. Dr. Torres made notes, her expression neutral. "Have you considered that the recipient might not survive the transplant? That your sacrifice might not achieve the outcome you're hoping for?" The question caught me off guard. In all my thinking about Victoria's condition and my potential role in saving her, I hadn't seriously considered that the surgery might fail. I suppose that's always a risk with any medical procedure. It is, and with kidney disease as advanced as Victoria's, the risks are higher than average. "Are you prepared for the possibility that she might die anyway, despite your donation?" I stared out the window at the healing garden, watching visitors and patients walk slowly along the paths between raised flower beds. "I think I'd rather try and fail than live knowing I could have helped and chose not to." Dr. Torres set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Natalie, I have to ask this directly. Is there something about your relationship with Victoria that you haven't told me?" The psychological profile suggests a level of emotional investment that seems disproportionate to a new friendship. The moment of truth had arrived earlier than I'd expected. I'd planned to tell Victoria everything before anyone else knew, but Torres was too perceptive to deflect indefinitely. "It's complicated," I said finally. "There are family connections I'm still trying to understand myself." "What kind of family connection?" I took a deep breath, realizing that once I said the words aloud to someone in an official capacity, there would be no taking them back. "I have reason to believe Victoria and I were switched as babies, that we've been living each other's lives for 27 years. Dr. Torres' pen stopped moving entirely. I'm sorry, what did you just say? Over the next hour, I told her everything. Caroline's deathbed confession, the documents in the safety deposit box, the Ashworth family's 12-year knowledge of the truth. Torres listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each revelation. Natalie, she said when I finished, this is an extraordinary claim. Have you had any independent verification of these documents? DNA testing, expert analysis of the hospital record. The Ashworth family's attorney has confirmed everything. They've known the truth for years. Dr. Torres was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications. This changes the psychological dynamic significantly. You're not just considering donation to a friend or even a distant relative. If what you're saying is true, you're considering donation to someone who has been living the life that should have been yours. Does that disqualify me from donation? Not necessarily, but it raises complex questions about your motivations. Are you doing this out of genuine altruism, or are you trying to resolve feelings of loss and displacement through a grand gesture? The question stung because it was so close to what I'd been asking myself. Maybe both. Does it matter if the outcome is the same? It matters for your long-term psychological health. Organ donation based on unresolved grief or identity issues can lead to serious emotional complications afterward. Dr. Torres made extensive notes. I'm going to recommend that you speak with a counselor who specializes in identity and adoption issues before we proceed further. The counselor was Dr. Michael Chen, a gentle man in his 50s, who worked primarily with adoptees and families, dealing with complex identity questions. His office was warm and comfortable, filled with books and soft lighting that encouraged confidences. Margaret Rothwell briefed me on your situation, Dr. Chen said as we settled into facing chairs. I have to say, in 30 years of practice, I've never encountered anything quite like that. Is that good or bad? Dr. Chen smiled. It's unique, and uniquely challenging for everyone involved. Let's start with how you're feeling about the discovery of your true identity. For the first time since Caroline's confession, I allowed myself to fully explore the emotions I'd been suppressing. Anger at Caroline for playing God with 2 babies, grief for the life I'd never had the chance to live, resentment toward Victoria for unknowingly benefiting from my stolen advantages, but also guilt about that resentment, since Victoria was as much a victim as I was. It's like finding out your entire life has been based on someone else's lie. Every struggle I've had, every opportunity I missed, happened because a nurse decided to fix 2 problems with one terrible solution. And how do you feel about Victoria specifically? That was the hardest question to answer honestly. She's intelligent, compassionate, doing meaningful work with the privileges she inherited, but I also can't help thinking about what my life might have been if I'd grown up with those same privileges. Do you blame her for having the life you should have had? Intellectually, no. She didn't choose this any more than I did. But emotionally, I paused, trying to articulate feelings I'd barely admitted to myself. Sometimes I watch her take for granted things I've never been able to afford, and I feel angry, not at her personally, but at the situation. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Those feelings are completely understandable. The question is whether organ donation is a healthy way to process them. Are you hoping that saving Victoria's life will somehow balance the scales, give you back some of what was taken? The insight was uncomfortable in its accuracy. Maybe. Is that wrong? It's human, but it's also potentially problematic if you're expecting the donation to resolve your identity issues or provide closure for your grief. Medical procedures can't fix emotional wounds, and if you're hoping for something this surgery can't provide, you'll likely be disappointed. Over 3 sessions with Dr. Chen, we explored my motivations from every angle. He helped me understand that my desire to save Victoria wasn't just about altruism or even justice. It was about reclaiming some agency in a situation where I'd been powerless. For 27 years, other people had made decisions about my life without my knowledge or consent. Choosing to donate was perhaps the first truly autonomous decision I could make about my relationship with Victoria and the truth of our switched identities. But you need to be clear about what this decision can and cannot accomplish, Dr. Chen warned during our final session. Saving Victoria's life won't give you back the childhood you lost or the opportunities you missed. It won't resolve the complex emotions around your identity. Those are separate issues that will require ongoing work. Meanwhile, the medical tests were revealing what Dr. Kim called an exceptional compatibility. Not only were Victoria and I tissue matched, but our blood chemistry and immune markers were nearly identical. It was almost as if we were twins, which made sense given that we'd been born within hours of each other to parents who likely shared similar genetic backgrounds. I've rarely seen a match this perfect between unrelated individuals, Dr. Kim told me during our results consultation. If you decide to proceed, Victoria's chances of successful transplant are very high. The psychological evaluation had been more complex. Dr. Torres ultimately cleared me for donation, but with the caveat that I continue counseling both before and after the procedure. She'd also recommended that Victoria be informed about our relationship before the surgery, a suggestion that aligned with my own insistence. Margaret Rothwell was not pleased with this development. We met in her office, a sterile space filled with legal books and expensive furniture that spoke of old money and established power. The family's position has always been that Victoria should be protected from this information, Margaret said, her tone crisp with disapproval. Learning about the switch now when she's already facing a life-threatening illness could be psychologically devastating. She's going to wonder why I'm willing to give her a kidney, I replied. Don't you think she deserves to know the truth? We can present it as altruistic donation. It happens more often than you might think. I shook my head. I won't lie to her. If the Ashworth family wants my kidney, Victoria learns the truth first. Those are my terms. Margaret was silent for several minutes, clearly calculating the family's option. Finally, she spoke with obvious reluctance. Very well, but we do this carefully, with psychological support for Victoria, and with the understanding that if this information causes her to reject the transplant, you bear responsibility for that. The weight of that responsibility was enormous. I could be saving Victoria's life or destroying her will to live, depending on how she processed the revelation that her entire identity was built on a lie. We scheduled the conversation for the following week, giving me time to prepare for what would arguably be the most difficult discussion of my life. How do you tell someone that everything they thought they knew about themselves was wrong? That their parents weren't their biological family? That their entire privileged existence was built on another person's crime? I spent those days researching everything I could about how adoptees and switched-at-birth individuals processed identity revelation. The psychological literature was mixed. Some people integrated the information relatively well while others experienced severe identity crises that took years to resolve. Much depended on the strength of their existing relationships and sense of self. Victoria seemed to have both advantages and disadvantages in this regard. Her work with the foundation gave her a strong sense of purpose and identity beyond her family name, but her illness and isolation meant she had fewer emotional resources to draw upon when processing traumatic information. I also used the time to prepare practical elements of what I would tell her. I organized Caroline's documents chronologically, created a timeline of events, and even prepared answers to questions Victoria was likely to ask. I wanted to present the information as clearly and compassionately as possible, with full acknowledgement of how devastating it must be to receive. Dr. Chen helped me rehearse the conversation, role-playing different scenarios based on how Victoria might react: anger, denial, breakdown, acceptance. We practiced responses to each possibility. He also arranged to be available immediately after the conversation, in case Victoria needed professional support. Remember, Chen said during our final preparation session, this isn't just about giving her information. You're asking her to reconstruct her entire understanding of herself and her family. Be patient with whatever reaction she has, even if it's not what you're hoping for. The morning of the conversation, I woke with a sick feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with physical illness. I was about to shatter someone's world, possibly destroy a friendship I'd come to value, and potentially sabotage the only chance of saving a life I'd grown to care about deeply. But I also knew it was the right thing to do. Victoria deserved the truth, even if that truth was painful. She deserved to make an informed decision about accepting my kidney, understanding the full context of why I was offering it, and she deserved to know who she really was, regardless of how that knowledge might complicate her remaining time. I drove to Victoria's penthouse apartment with Caroline's documents in a manila envelope beside me, knowing that this conversation would change both our lives forever. One way or another, the careful balance I'd maintained between truth and deception was about to collapse entirely. The doorman recognized me now and waved me up without calling ahead. Victoria met me at her door with a smile that made my heart ache, knowing how dramatically that expression was about to change. You look nervous, she said as she let me in. Is everything all right? We need to talk, I replied, setting the envelope on her coffee table. About why I'm really here, and about who we really are to each other. Victoria's smile faded as she saw the serious documents spread before us. Natalie, what's going on? I took a deep breath and began to tell her the truth about Caroline. About the switched babies, about the life she'd been living that was never meant to be hers. With each word I watched Victoria's world crumble around her, knowing that I was the one holding the hammer. Victoria's penthouse apartment felt smaller somehow as I spread Caroline's documents across her glass coffee table. The late afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the papers, and I could hear Victoria's sharp intake of breath as she recognized what she was looking at. Hospital records, she said quietly, her voice already changing. From Cedar Valley General. From when we were born. I nodded, my throat tight with the weight of what I was about to say. Victoria, there's something you need to know about Caroline Brennan. About what she did the night we were both born. Victoria sank into the leather chair across from me, her face already pale. She'd been having a good day health-wise, but I could see her energy draining as she processed the seriousness of what was happening. This is about more than organ donation, isn't it? Much more. I picked up the first document. Caroline's handwritten confession letter dated 27 years ago. Caroline was the charge nurse in the maternity ward the night you and I were born. She made a decision that changed both our lives forever. I read Caroline's letter aloud, watching Victoria's expression transform from confusion to shock to something approaching horror as the full scope of what had happened became clear. The switched identification bracelets, the altered records, the deliberate deception that had given me Victoria's life while she lived mine. When I finished reading, Victoria was completely still, staring at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. You're saying I'm not Robert and Helen's biological daughter? According to these records, no, Caroline switched us because their baby you was sick and might not survive, while I was healthy. She thought she was giving my father a perfect child after he'd lost so much. Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for the hospital records, scanning the medical details with the sharp intelligence I'd come to admire. The blood typing is different here, she said, pointing to discrepancies between the original and altered document. And the footprints don't match what's in my baby book at home. Your parents know, I said gently. They've known for 12 years, since you needed the kidney transplant when you were 15. The betrayal of that revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. She doubled over slightly, one hand pressed to her stomach. 12 years. They've known for 12 years and never told me. They were trying to protect you. Margaret Rothwell said they felt the information would be too traumatic, especially given your medical condition. Victoria's laugh was bitter and sharp. Protect me, right? So instead of letting me decide how to handle the truth about my own identity, they decided for me, just like Caroline decided for us when we were babies. She stood abruptly and walked to the windows, staring out at Elliott Bay without seeing it. Do you know who my real parents are? The people who gave birth to the baby that should have grown up as Victoria Ashworth. I pulled out another document, one I'd been dreading to share. Your biological mother was Lisa Chen. She was 18, unmarried, and planning to give you up for adoption. Your biological father had already left before you were born, so I would have been adopted anyway. Victoria's voice was flat, emotionless. I would never have grown up with the Ashworth name or money regardless. Probably not. But that doesn't make what Caroline did right. Victoria turned back to me, her eyes now blazing with anger I'd never seen before. And you're the baby who should have grown up as their daughter. You should have had the private schools, the trust fund, the opportunities I took for granted. The accusation in her voice stung, even though I'd expected it. I didn't choose this any more than you did. But you've known the truth longer than I have. How long have you been planning the friendship, the volunteering with the foundation, getting close to me? Was it all manipulation? The question felt like a slap. No, when I first learned the truth, I was angry and confused. But getting to know you, seeing the work you do, understanding who you are as a person, that changed everything. Changed it how? Victoria's voice was getting stronger, fueled by rage. Made you feel guilty that the sick baby grew up to do good things with the advantages that should have been yours. I stood up, needing to match her energy level. Made me realize that Caroline's crime created two victims, not just one. You didn't ask to be raised by the wrong family any more than I asked to grow up wondering why I never felt like I quite fit in anywhere. Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her brilliant mind working through the implications. The organ donation. That's why you're really willing to give me your kidney. Not because we're friends, but because you feel responsible for me somehow. It's more complicated than that. Is it? Victoria moved closer,
her eyes intense with fever-bright anger. "You found out I was dying with kidneys that were never meant to be mine in the first place, and decided to save me with the kidney I should have had all along. How poetic." The sarcasm in her voice cut deep. "That's not why I'm doing this." "Then why would someone risk major surgery for a woman who's been living her stolen life?" I'd rehearsed this answer with Dr. Chen, but standing here facing Victoria's fury, the carefully prepared words felt inadequate.
Because despite everything, you've done something meaningful with the advantages you inherited. The foundation, the lives you've changed, the work that matters, that's not about money or privilege. That's about who you chose to become. Victoria's anger seemed to deflate slightly, replaced by something more complex. And who am I, exactly, if I'm not Victoria Ashworth, daughter of Robert and Helen, heir to generations of careful breeding and social positioning? Then who am I? You're the person who transformed a tax shelter foundation into something that actually helps people. You're the person who remembers the names of homeless shelter residents and follows up on scholarship recipients. You're the person who chose to use unearned advantages to lift up people who remind me of myself. Victoria walked back to the coffee table and picked up another document, this one showing the original birth certificate with her real parents' names. Lisa Chen. I don't even know if she's still alive. She is. I had Margaret's investigators look into it. She's a social worker in Portland now. Never married, dedicated her life to helping kids in foster care. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Victoria's biological mother had spent her career helping vulnerable children, while Victoria herself had focused on helping vulnerable adults. Their shared impulse towards service had manifested despite being raised in completely different circumstances. Does she know about me? No. She thinks the daughter she gave up was placed with a loving family somewhere, but she was never given details about what happened after the adoption. Victoria set down the document with shaking hands. So she's spent 27 years wondering about a child who was supposedly adopted, not knowing that child was raised by millionaires in Seattle. Margaret could arrange contact if you wanted, after you've had time to process everything. Process everything. Victoria laughed again, but this time there was hysteria creeping into the sound. Process that my entire identity is built on a lie. Process that my parents have been lying to me for 12 years. Process that there's another woman out there who has no idea what happened to her biological daughter. She walked to her kitchen and opened a cabinet, pulling out a bottle of whiskey that looked expensive and untouched. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely pour it into a glass. Victoria, maybe you shouldn't. Shouldn't what? Shouldn't drink when I just found out my entire life is fiction. She took a large sip and winced. Shouldn't have alcohol when I'm on immunosuppressants. Shouldn't make any sudden decisions when I'm emotionally compromised. The bitter edge to her words worried me. I know this is overwhelming. Overwhelming. Victoria set down the glass and turned to face me fully. That's an interesting word choice. You know what's overwhelming? Finding out that the person offering to save your life is the person whose life you stole. Finding out that your parents have been lying to you for over a decade. Finding out that somewhere there's a woman who gave birth to you and never knew you were raised in luxury. While she probably struggled with the decision to give you up. I could see Victoria spiraling, her usual composure cracking under the weight of too many revelations at once. Chen is available if you want to talk to someone professional about this. Someone who specializes in identity issues. Identity issues. Victoria's voice was getting higher, more strained. Is that what we're calling this? I don't have identity issues, Natalie. I don't have an identity at all. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about my place in the world, it's all based on a nurse's decision to play God with two babies. She walked back to the windows, pressing her palms against the glass. Do you know what the worst part is? It makes sense. I never understood why Robert and Helen seemed so distant sometimes. Why I never felt like I quite belonged in their social circle. Why the family dynamics always felt slightly off. I thought it was because of my illness, because I was different from what they expected their daughter to be. They love you, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Do they? Or do they love the idea of me? The daughter they thought they were getting when Caroline made her decision. Victoria's reflection in the window looked ghostly, insubstantial. How do I trust anything they've ever told me when they've been lying about something this fundamental for 12 years? The apartment fell silent except for the distant sounds of Seattle traffic far below. I watched Victoria's shoulders shake and realized she was crying, her tears leaving small marks on the glass. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but you told me anyway. Why? Victoria wiped her eyes and turned back to me. Why not just donate the kidney and let me go on believing the lie? It would have been easier for everyone. Because you deserve to know. Because I couldn't make such a major decision about your life without you understanding the full context. I paused, choosing my words carefully, and because I hoped that knowing the truth might help both of us figure out how to move forward. Move forward. Victoria's voice was steadier now, though her eyes were still red. Assuming I survive the transplant, what exactly are you proposing we move forward to? Some kind of twisted sister relationship based on the fact that we were switched at birth. The question hung in the air between us, highlighting how impossible our situation really was. We weren't sisters by blood or by upbringing. We were strangers connected only by a crime committed before we were old enough to have any say in the matter. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe we figure that out as we go. Victoria studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her sharp intelligence working through all the angles of our situation. The organ donation, are you still willing to go through with? Now that I know the truth, now that I'm angry and confused and probably not very gracious about accepting such a sacrifice. Yes, I said without hesitation. Nothing about that has changed. Even though I might resent you afterward, even though this revelation might complicate any relationship we try to build. I thought about that carefully before answering. Even then, because regardless of how you feel about me personally, you're doing work that matters. The foundation will continue to help people whether we're friends or strangers, or something in between. Victoria walked back to the coffee table and picked up Caroline's confession letter, reading through it again more slowly. She was wrong, you know, Caroline, about me being sickly and possibly dying. I recovered completely from whatever was wrong with me as a newborn. I know, Margaret mentioned. So her justification for the switch, saving a dying baby while giving a healthy one to a grieving father, was based on a medical condition that resolved itself within weeks. Victoria set down the letter with deliberate care. She destroyed two families' understanding of themselves based on a problem that fixed itself naturally. The full tragedy of Caroline's decision was becoming clearer the more we talked about it. She'd acted out of compassion, but without the patience to see how the situation might evolve naturally. Her interference had created decades of deception and identity confusion that might never be fully resolved. What happens now? Victoria asked. Do I confront Robert and Helen about lying to me? Do I try to contact Lisa Chen? Do I go through with the transplant knowing that you're not really doing this out of friendship but out of some complex mix of guilt and obligation? What do you want to happen? Victoria was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the darkening sky over Puget Sound. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, steadier, more resolved. I want to meet her, Lisa Chen. I want to understand who I might have been if Caroline hadn't intervened. She turned back to me. And I want you to understand that if we do this, if you give me your kidney and I survive, we're not going to magically become a family. We're two people dealing with the consequences of someone else's decision, and that's complicated in ways that don't have easy resolution. I understand that. Do you? Because I can see it in your eyes, Natalie. You're hoping this will give you something back, some sense of justice or closure or belonging. But saving my life won't undo the 27 years of different experiences that shaped us into different people. Her words stung because they were accurate. I had been hoping for something that medical procedures couldn't provide, some sense of balance restored, some cosmic justice. But Victoria continued, if you're still willing to go through with the donation knowing that it won't fix the fundamental weirdness of our situation, then I'm willing to accept it. Not as Victoria Ashworth accepting charity from a stranger, but as someone who doesn't really know who she is accepting help from someone who doesn't really know who she is either. The next morning, Victoria called Margaret Rothwell and informed her that she knew about the switch, and still wanted to proceed with the transplant. Margaret's relief was palpable even through the phone, though she immediately began discussing damage control with the Ashworth family. Robert and Helen requested an emergency meeting that afternoon, and Victoria asked me to be present when she confronted them about their decade of deception. Their Bellevue mansion felt even more imposing as we sat in the formal living room, 4 people navigating the collapse of carefully maintained lies. Helen wept as Victoria detailed what she now knew, while Robert remained stoically silent until Victoria finished speaking. Then he looked directly at me with eyes that held more anger than grief. I hope you're satisfied, he said coldly. You've destroyed this family's peace for the sake of your own emotional needs. Robert, Helen said sharply, but he continued. Victoria was happy. She was doing meaningful work, had a stable life, was managing her illness with dignity. Now you've shattered her sense of identity because you couldn't live with the knowledge alone. Victoria's response surprised everyone, including, actually, Dad, She did exactly what you should have done 12 years ago. She treated me like an adult capable of handling difficult truths instead of a child who needed protection from reality. The word dad hung in the air, highlighting the complexity of their relationship now that biology had been removed from the equation. We are your parents, Helen said firmly. Biology doesn't change 27 years of love and care. Love and care built on a lie. Victoria replied, but her voice was gentler when she spoke to Helen than it had been to Robert. I understand why you made the decision to keep this secret, but I deserve the chance to make my own choices about how to handle it. The meeting dissolved into tears and recriminations, and tentative attempts at reconciliation that would clearly take much longer than one conversation to resolve. But by the end of it, everyone understood that the transplant would proceed as planned, and that our complicated new reality would have to be navigated one difficult conversation at a time. The surgery was scheduled for the following month, giving Victoria time to meet Lisa Chen and giving all of us time to prepare for the physical and emotional challenges ahead. But the hardest revelation was behind us now, and somehow, despite the pain and confusion it had caused, I felt like we were finally dealing with the truth instead of the comfortable lies that had defined our lives for so long. The meeting between Victoria and Lisa Chen took place on a crisp October morning at a small cafe in Portland's Pearl District. I drove Victoria down from Seattle, both of us nervous about this encounter that would complete the circle of Caroline's long-ago deception. Victoria had been quiet during the 2-hour drive, staring out the window at the changing autumn landscape with an expression I couldn't read. Lisa Chen was smaller than I'd expected, a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She worked as a social worker specializing in foster care placement, and when Margaret Rothwell had contacted her about meeting the daughter she'd given up for adoption 27 years ago, she'd agreed immediately despite her obvious nervousness. Victoria and I arrived first, settling into a corner booth while we waited. Victoria's hands were shaking slightly, and I could see the toll that weeks of emotional upheaval had taken on her already fragile health. What if she doesn't like who I became? Victoria asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been building during our drive. She gave you up because she wanted you to have a better life than she could provide at 18. I think she'll be proud of the work you're doing, regardless of how that life came about. When Lisa walked through the cafe door, there was an immediate recognition that had nothing to do with physical resemblance. Something in her posture, her careful way of moving through the world, reminded me instantly of Victoria. They shared a gentleness that had survived very different life experiences. Lisa spotted us immediately, perhaps sensing the same recognition, and approached our table with tears already forming in her eyes. Victoria, she said softly. Victoria stood slowly, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then Lisa reached out tentatively and touched Victoria's face, as if confirming she was real. You're so beautiful, Lisa whispered. I dreamed about what you might look like, but you're more beautiful than I imagined. They embraced carefully, two strangers connected by biology and separated by lies they'd only recently learned about. I felt like an intruder witnessing this moment, but Victoria had asked me to stay for moral support, and I could see she needed the anchor of a familiar presence. Over coffee and pastries neither of them touched, Victoria and Lisa shared their stories. Lisa spoke about the difficult decision to give Victoria up for adoption, about the young man who'd abandoned her when she became pregnant, about the years she'd spent wondering what happened to the child she'd carried. I went into social work partly because of you, Lisa admitted. I kept thinking about all the children who needed safe homes, and I wanted to help make sure they found them. Victoria told Lisa about growing up with the Ashworth family, about her education and her work with the foundation, carefully avoiding the darker details about her illness and the complex emotions around her switched identity. The family who adopted you gave you everything I'd hoped for, Lisa said, tears streaming down her face. Education, opportunities, the chance to help other people. I made the right decision, even though it broke my heart. What neither of them said directly, but what hung in the air between them, was the bitter irony that Lisa's biological daughter had indeed been raised in privilege, but only because of a crime that had stolen that privilege from another family. After 2 hours, Lisa had to leave for work, but not before exchanging contact information with Victoria and making plans to meet again soon. As we watched her walk away through the cafe window, Victoria was quiet for a long time. She's exactly what I hoped she'd be, Victoria said finally. Kind, thoughtful, someone who turned her own painful experience into a way to help others. Does meeting her change how you feel about everything? Victoria considered the question carefully. It makes Caroline's decision even more tragic. Lisa would have been a wonderful mother if she'd had the chance and support. She didn't need someone to rescue her baby from her. She needed someone to help her become the parent she was capable of being.
The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Victoria had spent the past month regaining some physical strength and emotional equilibrium, while I had completed my own preoperative preparation. The psychological counseling had helped both of us understand that the transplant was just the beginning of a much longer process of figuring out how to build a relationship from the wreckage of Caroline's deception. Kim walked us through the final preoperative consultation, explaining the risks one more time and confirming that we both understood the permanence of what we were about to do. The surgery would take several hours for each of us, with Victoria's procedure beginning shortly after mine to minimize the time the kidney spent outside a human body. Any final questions? Dr. Kim asked. Victoria looked at me across the consultation room. If something goes wrong during my surgery, if I don't make it through the procedure, I want you to know that I don't regret learning the truth. It was painful, but it was better than living a lie. Nothing's going to go wrong, I said firmly, though we both knew that was a promise I couldn't make. The morning of surgery, I woke up in my hospital room, feeling strangely calm. All the emotional turmoil, all the complex negotiations and psychological preparation, had led to this moment. I was about to give part of my body to a woman who had lived my life, and somehow that felt right in a way that transcended logic. Victoria stopped by my room, before we were both taken to pre-op. She looked small and vulnerable in her hospital gown, but her eyes were clear and determined. Thank you, she said simply. For the kidney, for telling me the truth. For helping me understand who I really am. Thank you for showing me who I might have been if I'd grown up with your advantages. And for proving that people can choose to do good things regardless of how they got their opportunities. The anesthesia took me under before I could say anything else, but I felt peaceful as consciousness faded. Whatever happened next, we'd both chosen to face the truth instead of living with comfortable lies. I woke up 8 hours later to find Dr. Kim smiling at my bedside. The surgery went perfectly, she said. Your kidney is functioning beautifully in its new home, and Victoria is already showing signs of improvement. The recovery was long and sometimes painful, but knowing that Victoria was growing stronger made every difficult day worth enduring. She visited me as soon as she was able to walk the hallways, and we spent hours talking about our plans for the future. I want to expand the foundation's work, Victoria said during one of these conversations. Focus more on addressing the systemic issues that create homelessness and poverty in the first place. Less charity, more justice. That sounds like something Lisa would be proud of. Victoria smiled. I've been thinking about asking her to join the foundation's board. Her experience in social work could help us develop better programs. 6 months after the surgery, Victoria and I were both fully recovered and navigating the strange new reality of our relationship. We weren't sisters, exactly. But we weren't just friends either. We were something new, two people connected by a shared trauma, who had chosen to build something positive from the wreckage. The Ashworth family had struggled more with the revelation. Helen had eventually accepted the truth and worked to rebuild her relationship with Victoria. But Robert remained distant and bitter. He blamed me for disrupting their family's peace, and while he was civil during necessary interactions, the warmth was gone. He'll come around eventually, Victoria said when I expressed concern about the ongoing tension. Or he won't, and that will be his loss. I can't make my choices based on his inability to process difficult truth. Lisa Chen had indeed joined the foundation's board, bringing decades of experience working with vulnerable populations. Her first major initiative was a program to support young mothers, who might otherwise consider giving up their children, providing housing assistance, childcare, and job training so they could keep their It's what I needed 27 years ago, Lisa explained to me when I asked about her motivation. If someone had helped me figure out how to be a parent instead of assuming I couldn't handle it, maybe none of this would have happened. The program was named the Caroline Brennan Initiative, a decision Victoria made over my initial objections. She was wrong about almost everything, Victoria explained, but she was trying to help. The best way to honor that impulse is to create better solutions than the one she chose. A year after the surgery, Victoria and I traveled together to Europe, fulfilling the trip we'd planned during her recovery. We visited museums and galleries, took cooking classes in Tuscany, and spent long evenings in sidewalk cafes talking about our respective childhoods and the paths that had led us to each other. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Caroline had never made the switch? Victoria asked one evening as we sat overlooking the Mediterranean from a restaurant terrace in Nice. Sometimes, but then I think about how we might never have met. And despite everything complicated about our situation, I'm grateful we found each other. Victoria raised her wine glass. To Caroline's misguided attempt at playing God, and to our choice to build something better from her mistakes. We clinked glasses as the sun set over the water, two women who had learned that identity wasn't just about biology or upbringing, but about the conscious choices we made about who to become. The foundation continued to grow under Victoria's leadership, eventually expanding to other cities and inspiring similar organizations across the country. Lisa became not just a board member, but a surrogate mother to Victoria, providing the maternal relationship that had been missing from her life despite Helen's best effort. I eventually left my job as a dental hygienist and went back to school for a master's degree in social work, funded by a scholarship the foundation created for career changers entering helping profession. My thesis research focused on the long-term effects of medical errors on families, and I became an advocate for greater transparency in healthcare settings. You're using your experience to prevent other families from going through what we went through, Victoria observed, when I told her about my new career direction. It's what you taught me, I replied, that we can choose to transform our pain into something that helps other people. 2 years after the surgery, we received an unexpected phone call from Cedar Valley Medical Center. They were conducting an internal review of historical cases and had discovered evidence of the switched birth record. The hospital administration wanted to meet with us to discuss potential legal action against Caroline's estate and to offer counseling services for families affected by similar medical errors. Victoria and I drove together to Cedar Valley for the meeting, both of us emotionally prepared for what would likely be the final chapter in our understanding of Caroline's action. The hospital's legal team was clearly worried about liability issues, but we surprised them by declining to pursue legal action. Caroline is dead, Victoria said simply. Punishment won't undo what she did, and we've both built good lives despite her interference. We'd rather focus on making sure something like this can't happen again. Instead, we worked with the hospital to develop new protocols for newborn identification and family notification procedure. The Caroline Brennan Patient Safety Initiative became a model for other medical facilities, ensuring that adequate checks and balances existed to prevent future incidents of switched identity. The final surprise came 3 years after the surgery, when Lisa Chen announced her engagement to a colleague from her social work agency. Victoria and I were both invited to the wedding, where we served as Lisa's surrogate family and witnessed her begin the happy life she'd been denied as a young woman. She deserves this, Victoria whispered as we watched Lisa dance with her new husband. She deserves everything, I agree. As I write this, 5 years have passed since Caroline's deathbed confession changed both our lives forever. Victoria's kidney function remains excellent, her health is stable, and the foundation has helped thousands of people transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment. I completed my master's degree and now work as a hospital social worker, helping families navigate medical crises and ensuring that patients understand their rights and options. My own experience with medical deception has made me a fierce advocate for transparency and informed consent. Victoria and I remain close, though our relationship continues to evolve as we both grow and change. We're not the sisters we might have been if we'd grown up together, but we're something perhaps more valuable, two people who chose to create family from the ruins of someone else's decision. We still visit Caroline's grave together every year on the anniversary of her death, bringing flowers and sharing updates about our lives. It's become a tradition that feels appropriate, acknowledging the woman whose actions brought us together while also recognizing the pain her choices caused. Do you forgive her? Victoria asked during our most recent visit. I considered the question as I do every year. I understand her. She was trying to fix something that was broken, but she didn't think about the long-term consequence. I think forgiveness is less important than making sure we learned something from what she did. Victoria nodded, placing daffodils on Caroline's headstone. She gave us each other eventually, just not in the way she planned. As we walked away from the cemetery that day, I reflected on how much had changed since that night in the hospital when Caroline made her devastating confession. 2 babies had been switched decades ago by a nurse who thought she was solving problems, but the real solutions had come from our choice to face the truth and build something meaningful from it. The foundation continues its work. Lisa Chen has found the happiness that eluded her as a young mother, and Victoria and I have created a relationship that transcends biology and circumstance. Caroline's crime became the foundation for our choice to help others, to advocate for transparency, and to prove that family can be built from truth and shared purpose, rather than just genetics or legal documents. Sometimes the most profound healing comes not from undoing the past, but from choosing how to move forward despite its imperfection. Caroline couldn't give us back our original identities, but she inadvertently gave us something else: the opportunity to discover that who we become is ultimately more important than who we were meant to be. In the end, that might be the most valuable gift of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.